Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth in our series of webcasts on international trade. I'm Ian Forsyth and with me again is Ewan Ramsey, and today we're going to be talking about export documentation. Before we do that, however, if you are new to this format, one of the things I really need to emphasise at this point is that you can ask questions. It's not just the questions we've pre-prepared here. We will be taking your questions towards the end of this afternoon's session, I should say. And to submit a question, all you have to do is type it into the chat box, which is on the right-hand side of the video window that I'm in at the moment. Hit enter, and it will come through to us here, and we will try to get through as many of your questions as we possibly can. But it is a first come, first served basis, so if you do desperately want to get Ewan to answer a question about export documentation, make sure that you get your questions in early. So Ewan, I always do the depressing what happens if you get it wrong, but with export documentation it sounds like it could get really depressing if you got it wrong. What are the pitfalls?
I think it's like a lot of aspects of international trade. If you don't thoroughly do your research and understand where it fits into the overall export journey, if you like, then it can cause you problems. It's really at the stage of the transaction where incorrect documentation can lead to product being stuck in port, being refused entry at customs, and that can have a cost impact from your own perspective. So there's plenty of support available. There's plenty of things to look out for to try and make sure that you do it right first time. And hopefully over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, we can keep everybody on the right path.
Okay, so as ever, we want to try and make sure that none of our viewers today fall into those pitfalls.
Definitely.
Right, we'll do our best. That's our challenge.
Okay.
See how we get on. We're going to go over to Tanya, who's going to just set the scene in terms of the export documentation journey. So let's hear from Tanya now.
For many SMEs, having the relevant, appropriate and correctly completed documentation is one of the most complex and frightening issues for a new export business to navigate. As a result, this is often one of the biggest barriers to effective exporting for many companies. Navigating your way through the ever-changing regulations for the relevant documents can be time-consuming to get right and costly to get wrong. The accurate completion and official authentication of export documentation is vital if customs penalties and delays are to be avoided and shipments are to make delivery deadlines. For the new exporter, one of the challenges is not knowing where to start. Even if you have experience in exporting, documentation can still be one of the most challenging elements of exporting. To begin to understand documentation, it is helpful to gain knowledge of the context surrounding documentation and where it fits within the broader export process. Documentation is, after all, just another piece of the jigsaw of exporting, and beginning to understand the importance of the information that is required to be completed on the documentation is a good place to start. Care should be taken with ever-changing methods of information media, as this can change quite quickly. For example, some export documentation can now be completed online, whereas other documentation still has to be completed in hard copy, sometimes with specific colours of pen. So, to get started, you should find someone who can help take you through the maze of documentation. Scottish Development International, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and Inverness Chamber of Commerce work together to provide a coherent package of support so that exporters, both old and new, are able to get the assistance they need to understand and complete the relevant paperwork and documentation for their overseas sales.
So it sounds like potentially negotiating the documentation maze could really be quite daunting. I think everyone's probably already aware that that is the case. Tanya suggested in the film, though, Ewan, that it's important to have a knowledge of the context surrounding the documentation and where that fits into the broader sort of export process, if you like.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that kind of contextual element?
I think when people start to export, whether for the first time or they've been doing it for a number of years, it can be quite daunting, and a lot of times people don't know where to start. And Over the last 3 or 4 webinars, we've talked about a range of subjects, Incoterms, payment methods, we've looked at distribution channels, we've also looked at supply chain. And the common feature, if you like, is that you can't treat one in isolation. So one aspect of international trade feeds the other parts of international trade. And it's the same with documentation. Depending on the type of customer you're working with, depending on the payment terms, the commercial contract that you've agreed, may well determine the type of documentation that you're looking to implement. You also need to watch out for it's not just the documentation that you, the seller of the product, has to complete. There may also be documentation that other third parties need to complete as well. That may include your own customer or an agent or distributor that acts on your behalf. So one thing that I've developed over the past few years is really an export discipline set of procedures. Break it down into 5 simple stages. And I think that's a good place to start, not only for documentation, but for all aspects of international trade. So the 5 stages, very much to start off with, you secure the order. Then you've got the pre-shipping phase. Then you've got the shipping phase itself. Then the disposal of the documents, and then finally the conclusion of the transaction. So to try and just start to break it down into bite-sized chunks, that will provide an element of context and structure as to where documentation fits in regarding the sale or the transaction.
Okay, so I suppose if you're aware where it comes at each of these stages, then that makes it at least a little bit easier.
Yeah.
We'll hear more later on about the various bits of guidance and assistance that's out there. But as a starting point for that, like any guidance, it's important that you've kind of thought through what it is you need guidance on.
Very much.
What kind of preparation do people need to do? What sorts of things do they need to have at their fingertips before they go looking for guidance and documentation?
It's a good question, because I regularly get asked questions about documentation, and then I start off by not answering the question, but by asking the customer 6 or 7 follow-on questions. So I guess some basics to think about before you go seeking advice is really to understand as many of the aspects of the export discipline process that I just touched on. You want to understand who you're selling to, so who is your customer? Is it an end customer in an overseas country? Is it an agent? Is it a distributor? You want to understand the quantities, the measures, the weights of the transaction that you're actually exporting, into which country. You want to do as much of a background research as to the documentation that's required for that particular market. And really, if you take the 5 stages of the export discipline process and just go through them one by one and map out as many of the different elements of that transaction so that you've got as much detail as possible, you can then go to Highlands and Islands Enterprise, the Smart Exporter Technical Help Desk, for example. They can then help you fit in the rest of the pieces of the jigsaw. But it's important to try and be as clear and clarify as many of these aspects as possible, not only so that you can get the right advice, but also to make sure that you are covering yourself from a risk perspective and that there aren't any grey areas in your commercial contract and you don't know the answer. So it can be quite a nice sense check for you to almost go back to basics and make sure that your understanding of the commercial transaction is the same as your customer.
Right, okay, so it sounds very much, you use an analogy of a jigsaw there, it's very much getting the pieces lined up and then you can get help to do that.
Very much so.
Yeah, okay. In the second of our films from Tanya, we're going to look at the different types of documentation that might be needed by exporters. So let's hear a bit more from Tanya on types of documentation at this stage.
Export documentation is required by all countries to satisfy the requirements of customs in the importing country or, depending on the payment method, by the overseas bank. Ultimately, you won't be able to export without the right paperwork. Incorrect paperwork can prove costly both in time, money, and resource. To start to gain an understanding of documentation, it is best to split the different types of documentation into 4 categories. Firstly, commercial documentation, then shipping documentation, customs documentation, and finally, documentation that is specific for the destination market. When assessing what documentation you require to complete, consideration should be given to the profile of the document in question. There are 3 factors which determine the required information: the level of data content, the purpose of the document, which ultimately determines the type of document needed, and the financial impact to you and your business with regards to export documentation. These costs exist whether the documentation is completed correctly or otherwise, and must always be factored into your pricing policy. Most documentation has a direct cost to the company who is selling, and as a result, the buyer. Whether your freight forwarder is completing the documentation or you are completing it yourself, there will always be a cost to consider. Remember that some of these costs may appear to be otherwise hidden within a large freight or logistics charge. Documentation which relates to customs, excise or duty may incur a liability in terms of duties or taxes, all of which should be considered. Lastly, failure to complete the documentation correctly or in a timely manner may end up in a penalty or fines being imposed, which would need to be borne by you and potentially cause delays in your goods arriving at their destination.
So one of the things we heard about there was the 4 categories of documentation that can apply when you're exporting. So Ewan, I think it might be useful to just go through each of the 4 in a little bit more detail. So the first one we heard about was commercial documentation. Can you give us a little bit about that?
I think before I start breaking into the 4 segments, I would say that the slide that shows the 4 different categories is crucial in having as a little aid memoir for you. So when you start to export for the first time, or if you've been doing it for many, many years, have that sitting on your desktop or beside you, and that can help provide a bit of a structure, if you like. And it takes some of the panic away from what do I do if I'm trying to enter into a new market.
Right.
In terms of commercial, that's very much all about the product. So we're looking at the packing list, the commercial invoice, and it's very much detailing what it is you're looking to export. Within this category, you'd also have something called a certificate of origin, which we'll touch on later on in the webcast. And we also cover off issues such as insurance certificates and cover, and really all of the commercial side of the transaction to ship it from A to B.
Right. So shipping is then the second stage, so that's what we move into next.
Yeah, and shipping is an area that a lot of early stage exporters don't really spend time getting to know and understand. Large reason for that is that if they use a freight forwarder, a lot of the companies tend to pass all that over to the freight forwarder. But it's a very good discipline to understand what the freight forwarder is going to do on your behalf, and if there are any elements of documentation that are still your responsibility. So effectively, shipping is how you get the product from your premises to the end customer. There might be a number of aspects that impact on that. So we talked about Incoterms in one of the earlier webinars, and that will determine who owns the goods at what stage of that life cycle. So shipping is very, very critical. Also an area that you need to make sure that your product is covered with adequate insurance coverage from A to B, because that's an area that's quite often not fully understood. So sit down and talk with your freight forwarder, really to understand what they're doing on your behalf, but to understand why they're doing it and what responsibilities are still on your shoulders.
Okay. You ruined it for me there, Ewan. As you were talking about shipping, straight in my head came the Incoterms one we had done earlier, and I thought, I'm going to be able to sound really clever. But you got there before me. So after shipping, we come on to customs.
Customs can be a complex area, but it's also an area that there's a wealth of resource and assistance and advice out there. Customs is really making sure that you can get your products out of the UK or out of the EU in the most efficient manner from a customs and a tax perspective. It also looks at the destination market and any of the documentation and paperwork that you need to move into that marketplace. One set of documentation that is often overlooked is something called an ATA carnet, which is effectively a passport for your goods. And that you would use that if you are going to an exhibition and you're exhibiting some of your products, but you're not looking to sell the products. So completing an ATA carnet will allow you to take product for exhibition, say to the United States. So if you're at a trade show, make sure that you don't have to pay any inward taxes as you arrive into the US, and it means that you can take them back out again in an appropriate fashion. And that's something that a lot of companies forget about or just aren't aware that they should have in place.
You mentioned specifically the US there. Does that only apply for...
No, there are approximately 100 countries across the globe that have ATA carnet relationships in respect of doing trade with the UK.
Right, just thought it was worth just clarifying on that. You also mentioned the documentation requirements for specific destination markets, and that was the last part that Tanya touched on. I can imagine that could be a real nightmare because it must vary hugely from one market to another.
It does, and it also isn't something that is fixed at any one time. It changes on a very regular basis. So as part of your market entry analysis and research, you really need to have a clear understanding about as many of the elements of taking your product into a new marketplace. One piece of documentation or set of documentation, if you like, is whether your product requires the importer in that country to have an import license. And that's something that I often come up against where companies are utilising an agent or a distributor in an overseas market. They don't know or they don't appreciate that that agent actually has to have an import license to be legally allowed to bring your product into that country. So you need to understand whether that's in place and then make sure that all of the rules and regulations are followed through so that your product can actually get into the country and then be on-sold to the end customers.
Okay. The other thing that was touched on in the film that I think might be worth exploring as well was the mention of the fact that, and it seems to be particularly the case if maybe you're using a freight forwarder, that there can be costs in there that are hidden. The obvious question I would have thought in most people's minds is, how do I find these hidden costs? Where would they be hidden?
I think the first thing to say is all documentation has a cost. So if by looking at the quotation or the overall aspect of exporting that you think there isn't a cost there is, generally speaking. So when you're speaking to the freight forwarder and they maybe give you an all-in-one price to operate on your behalf, be very clear what that price incorporates. Does it incorporate any aspects of documentation? If so, what is the documentation that is included within that price? Mm-hmm. When you're talking to the freight forwarder, you'll then understand what aspects of the documentation is responsible for you. And by going back to the 4 categories of documentation, you can clearly map out very much through each of the categories what has to be in place from a documentation perspective, who's responsible for dealing with that. And then if we revert back to the Incoterms that we discussed a couple of weeks ago, depending on what Incoterm you've used will also determine who's responsible for paying for certain elements of documentation. So we regularly get caught up in issues when companies don't price their products appropriately, and that's where they maybe dive in with a here's my quotation without taking a step back and understanding all of the different aspects of exporting.
Okay, I think that's good advice in terms of making sure that you don't overlook costs, because obviously that has to be built into your pricing in some shape or form. I think it's time to have a look at the third film from Tanya, and this time we're going to be looking at sources of information that are available online that will help you with documentation. So let's go over and hear from Tanya again, this time on those sources of information.
Gaining an understanding of exporting is a never-ending process for companies, whether they are experienced exporters or just starting out. One of the best bits of advice for any business who is looking to export is to take advantage of a range of support and sources of information to help you on a daily basis. When you export physical products overseas, your product will have a commodity code allocated to it, depending on its attributes. Commodity codes are 6-digit internationally accepted codes which classify shipped goods so that correct taxes and duties are applied and are the starting point for assessing which documentation you require for which market. The UK Trade Tariff website helps you to find commodity codes to classify goods for export and import. Commodity codes are used to find import duties, taxes, tax rebates, reliefs, licenses, and special conditions such as prohibitions that may apply to particular goods, all of which determine to a greater or lesser extent the type of documentation that requires to be completed. It is your responsibility as the exporter to ensure that you have correctly identified the commodity code for each of your product and product parts, and getting it wrong can have serious consequences, not only for you, but for the buyer as well. Another very helpful source of information in relation to export documentation is the EU Market Access Database. This is a website updated daily, which provides guidance on which documentation is required for particular markets and for specific commodity codes. You can use this website on a free-to-use basis. To give yourself an initial overview of the required documentation, all you need to do is to enter the market you are exporting to and the relevant commodity code, and you will see a brief overview of the required documentation and the issues to consider.
So it sounds like there are sources of information out there online that are helpful, but first can we just cover commodity codes?
Mm-hmm.
There was mention of that in the film there. What are they? How do they work?
If you export any physical goods out with the EU, you will have an 8 to 10 digit code for the product or for the parts of the products, if you like. And it's very important that you get an accurate commodity code for your product, because that then drives any customs clearance documentation, and it ensures that you pay the appropriate customs duties and taxes. It also drives some of the documentation that you have to complete as an exporter. So if you get your commodity code wrong, then that can therefore have a knock-on effect in some of the other aspects of your international trade transaction. Now, some common issues, if you like, companies that have maybe never exported to a certain market before, they ask their customer what the commodity code is, and the customer says the code is X. Mm-hmm. Don't just take that on face value. Commodity codes are globally recognized, so if the commodity code is a specific 8-digit number into one particular market, it will be that same 8 to 10-digit number going into another set of markets. So always check it. It's your responsibility as an exporter to make sure that it's accurate. And if it is inaccurate, then that can cause further delays on maybe at customs or getting clearance when it arrives into the destination market.
Okay, you said something there just at the beginning of your answer in relation to parts of the product. Just for clarity, does that mean you need to have different commodity codes for different parts?
Potentially. You may have a technical product that's made up of half a dozen different elements, and it may be that there are 3 or 4 different appropriate commodity codes depending on the constituent parts of the product. So it isn't just if you're selling, for example, a big turbine, you might not just have one code for the overall turbine. You might have 3 or 4 different codes depending on different parts as they all get assembled. So if it's exported in an unassembled format and they're all stored separately, then you might find that the different parts of the turbine have individual commodity codes. So you need to be as clear and as accurate as possible just to make sure that that is therefore accurate when it's clearing customs.
Again, just to make sure I've picked this up right, if the turbine has all been put together, then it would be one commodity code. It's only if it was the parts.
Depending.
Right, okay.
And again, you would then use something like the Trade Tariff Classification Help Checker, which I think we'll touch on in a few seconds, and that can provide absolute clarity. But don't make assumptions. Don't think that I've got the code right, so we'll just go with that. Make sure that it's absolute clear and concise, otherwise it may cause you problems further down the line.
Okay, so this would be the right time then to talk about the UK trade tariff resource that Tanya mentioned.
Yeah.
She also mentioned the EU market access database. It might be sensible to deal with them separately. So,
Yeah.
the UK trade tariff resource, what's that for?
There are two aspects to it. HMRC has an online tariff classification checker that allows you to go in and you enter the details of your product or the parts of your product, and you will go in and try and ascertain what your own commodity code is.
Mm-hmm.
What I would always do, especially if you're an early stage exporter, they have a telephone number which is a help desk manned Monday to Friday throughout office hours. I would always phone up and speak to one of the advisory team, explain what your product is, explain the constituent materials within your product, tell them what you believe your commodity code is to get that verified. The reason that I would always recommend that companies do that is if you've never exported before or you're a very early stage exporter, you may not be asking some of the questions that you should be asking when you're going in and trying to identify the appropriate commodity code. Why take any chances? Why make life more difficult for yourselves? These people who run the help desk do this day in, day out. They speak to thousands of companies every day. So clarify it as much as possible so that you can be as accurate as you can.
Okay. And the other one was the EU market access database.
This is a fantastic resource that really should be on everybody's desktop if you export, if you're looking at new markets, if you're regularly exporting to overseas markets. Always have it there. I check this every single day, and it's a very simple website that is updated daily. You're able to plug in the commodity code of the product that you're selling, plug in the market that you're either selling to or interested in selling to, and that will give you a first cut at all of the different issues that you need to be aware of. It will calculate customs duties and taxes, any of the appropriate licenses or documentation that you should be completing, and it just starts to build up an element of a picture for you so that you have more information to take either to High with the Smart Exporter team if you're looking for guidance or assistance, or if you're looking to go to the Chamber of Commerce, for example, to help get your certification completed. So it just helps to understand what costs and what documentation should be in place.
Right, okay, sounds like those are two resources that no one should sort of skip past.
Absolutely not.
Right.
And it's free to use, and as I say, it's updated on a daily basis.
Right, okay. You touched earlier on third-party documentation, and now really is the time for us to hear a little bit more about that from Tanya. Third-party documentation, as I say, something that Ewan's already touched on, but now time to look at it in a little bit more detail. So let's hear from Tanya again.
By this stage, you will be starting to become slightly more familiar with some of the documentation terminology, how it impacts on you and your targeted overseas markets, and some of the costs which need to be taken into consideration. Now, you must also consider the documentation which is required by some of the third parties who you export to. A range of third parties may require to complete some documentation in relation to an overseas sale by you. Whether this is your bank, your customer's bank in the destination country, your agent or distributor, freight forwarders operating either on behalf of yourself or the buyer, customs authorities in the UK or the destination country, and also government agencies, again, both in the UK and overseas. This is not an exhaustive list of the third parties who may require to complete or receive documentation in relation to your overseas sale, but these factors should be considered. One issue that is often misunderstood or ignored by UK exporters is for some destination markets, the importer may require specific documentation or licenses to be allowed to import goods into that destination market. Many UK exporters don't think that this is an issue for them to consider. However, if this isn't fully thought through, then you could easily find your product held at customs and unable to get into the destination market. This will impact on your ability to sell into that country and may also impact on your ability to get paid depending on the payment method you have chosen. When selling to a new market for the first time, always take the time to consider each of the different categories of documentation and go through the same process for your third parties to ensure that you have not missed anything in your planning, as this will limit the risk going forward.
So we heard there from Tanya something that pretty much reiterated what Ewan started off by saying, which was go through the different categories of documentation in a general sense, but particularly in relation to third parties. I suppose the question that pops into my mind when I hear that kind of advice is, okay, that's fine, but where do I start?
Very much use the guidelines that we had on the second slide. By breaking it down into the 4 different categories, that enables an exporter to really look through things very methodically. So your third parties can range from your agents, your distributors who are possibly in the destination market. So you can then understand what documentation they need to complete. When you're looking at customs, you need to understand, depending on the Incoterm, who's responsible for customs documentation. And it really comes down to something that we touched on in the Incoterms webinar, which is you will choose the Incoterm that you want to give you the control that you want over the transaction. So if you were to do it in a way that you want to have absolute control to minimise your risk, then you would go under a certain Incoterm, and once you know the Incoterm, then you will know the different types of documentation that you're responsible for. So it's very much understanding your risk-reward scenario from an exporting perspective. One way of doing things might be different to one company as opposed to another. So it's understanding the bigger picture, understanding the supply chain, and having a clear understanding what your freight forwarder is going to do on your behalf, and equally importantly, what they're not going to do for you.
Okay. I mean, I suppose the other thing, apart from where do I start, which you've covered, what about how do I make sure that I don't miss anything? Because it sounds like there are a lot of third parties who could be involved in a transaction, and therefore it could be quite easy to miss something. What would your advice be there?
Is really coming back to, from memory, what we talked about in the first webinar, is if you're entering into a commercial agreement for an export transaction, make sure there's no grey areas. Make sure that you as the exporter understand every aspect to take it from your factory or your premises to the end user. And what I mean by that is that you understand who's responsible for the different risk points within that supply chain, understanding at what stage documentation is needed, either to release a product through customs or to get it through customs at the destination market end. Make sure that you fulfill any regulatory obligations, both in the UK but also going into another marketplace. And once you use your diagrams and your flow charts, that is all really part of your toolkit that you need to have in place, always making sure that it's getting refreshed and updated. So by using that information linked into the EU Market Access Database and some of the other tools that we've touched on, that enables you to be as on top of things as possible.
Okay. We're going to move to the last segment now, where Tanya is actually going to give us an overview of some of the sources of help. We heard about sources of information in one of the earlier segments, but this time round, Tanya is going to touch on sources of help that are available to help you with your export documentation.
So, I am nearly ready to export to a new market and know what documentation I need to be completed. What do I do now? HMRC are a fantastic source of information and guidance and should always be referred to in order to remain compliant. It is highly likely that you will be using a freight forwarder when exporting, particularly if you are selling in reasonable quantities. Make sure that you use your freight forwarder effectively by ensuring that you understand what documentation they are going to complete on your behalf, for what purpose, and who is going to keep a file on copy of the documentation to use when you receive an inspection by the authorities. Again, with everything else in exporting, take the time to meet with and talk to your freight forwarder prior to you using them for the first time, so that you can agree expectation levels and ask questions at an early stage. This will ensure that there are no hidden surprises further down the line which will come as a shock to you or your end customer. Inverness Chamber of Commerce has accreditation as an issuing body for certificates of origin and HMRC preferential certificates within Highlands and Islands. As for the first time, our regionally based businesses are able to get certificates and documents fulfilled on their doorstep, saving time and money. So, when you are ready to fulfill your export and you would like your documentation certified or completed, simply phone the Chamber, who will be able to walk you through the process with one of the documentation advisors. Support and guidance is provided to exporters and members of staff who are maybe doing this for the first time, so that any issues with the documentation can be picked up as early as possible.
So we heard there from Tanya about certificates of origin and HMRC preferential certificates. Tell us a bit more about those.
Certificates of origin really are certified statements that determine where your product originates from. So if you're exporting out with the EU, for example, some of the destination markets may require your product to be certified to say that it's come from the United Kingdom or it's come from the EU. And that is something that you would get from a local Chamber of Commerce, for example. In terms of preferential HMRC certificates, if you take a certificate such as an EUR1, that is really a certificate that enables companies that are exporting, again, out with the EU to make sure that they benefit from any preferential rates of customs duty. Now, that's applicable for any countries that have specific trade agreements with the UK and the EU. And again, you would tend to get that from your local Chamber of Commerce. Now, there are costs involved and there are timescales involved to get them implemented, but that is very much taken on a case-by-case basis depending on how often you require these certificates.
So that whole certificate thing and the Chamber element, that's something that the Chamber here in Inverness does help with. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, chambers within the United Kingdom have to be regulated by British Chambers of Commerce in order to be able to provide certificates of origin and HMRC preferential certificates. Inverness Chamber is now regulated to do that for companies based all across the Highlands and Islands. So now, for the first time, anybody based in the Highlands and Islands that needs any of their certificates done, all they have to do is phone the Chamber or pop in and they can all be dealt with from the office in Inverness.
Right, okay, so that takes all of the hassle out of it, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. We had a couple of questions that were sent in advance today, so I thought it'd be worth just finishing off on those. We're nearly out of time, but just to make sure we cover everything for everyone. Someone was asking, a friend of mine who's been exporting for years says I don't need to worry about understanding documentation, as my freight forwarder will do it for me. I think I know what your answer's going to be here, but let's just hear.
That's a common misconception, and it's something that I hear all the time, and it is really one of the key reasons why companies end up with problems. I would disagree with that statement strongly, because not only can it cause you issues in the supply chain and your product can be stuck somewhere down the line, but if you don't have even a basic understanding of documentation and certification, it can also impact on your pricing. And regularly I'll see companies that think exporting is going to provide them with a certain profit margin based on their initial calculations. The reality might be very different because they haven't factored in some of the costs involved with certificates of origin or EUR1s, for example. So don't just take what your freight forwarder says as gospel. At the end of the day, you need to ask the freight forwarder to deliver a certain service for you, so you need to have a broad and a basic understanding as to what you're going to ask the freight forwarder to do. So don't just assume that they will deliver everything on your behalf. You need to talk to the freight forwarder as early as possible, really before you start pricing any of your consignments, so that you can make sure that all of these additional costs are built into your end cost to the customer.
that kind of touches on the other question that was sent in to us, which is about the costs of documentation. I have to say this is something that kind of surprised me, because you tend to think, right, okay, it's documentation. Yes, there will be a cost involved,
Yeah.
but is it really that significant that it has to be built into the price?
Depends really on the volume, depends on the price point of the product that you're selling. To give you a rough example, a certificate of origin or an EUR1 will normally cost somewhere between £25 and £50 per certificate. So doesn't sound an awful lot, but if you're selling fairly small consignment, then that can have some kind of impact on the profit margin. If you take something like an ATA Carney, for example, when you're going to an exhibition overseas, this is something that is regularly not incorporated into the costs of going to an exhibition. Getting one carney in place can cost somewhere between £150 and £200.
Right.
So in itself, that can start to mount up in terms of costs. And if you've got a whole range of products that you want to take to an exhibition, for example, that you're not going to sell and you want to bring them back into the country, you just need to make sure that you understand the overall price. So it is something that to enable you to make the commercial decision, you need to understand what these costs are, who's paying for them. Again, may well be determined by the type of Incoterm that you have agreed with your customer.
Right, okay, and as you were kind of hinting at there, really it can also be the kind of cumulative effect if you're actually exporting a series of items.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, because we have touched on this in previous webcasts, but we haven't specifically mentioned it here. It feels like most of what we've talked about has been about products. Is there any documentation considerations if it's a service-based export that you're involved in, or not so much?
Not necessarily with certificates of origin or EUR1s, but depending on any issues to do with maybe intellectual property, depending on how you're delivering the service, whether that service is being delivered from the UK or whether it is being delivered in country. If it is delivered in country, is it for a day or two at a time, or are you sending staff to a destination country for 6, 8, 10 weeks at a time? That may well then have implications from a customs and a taxation perspective, both in the UK and in country. So while you may think, I'm selling a service, I don't need to worry about documentation, what I would say is always be wary of it and always be aware that documentation is not just certificates of origin and EUR1s, it can cover all of the different aspects. So really just, again, try and understand the overall process. And when it comes to services and selling services, one of the key factors to look upon is where will that service be delivered.
Okay, so you can't completely ignore it just because it's a service, is the bottom line.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have now run out of time, Ewan. For the final time, at least in this series, I have to say thank you very much. There's been a recurring theme in terms of the comments that we've got, that you've actually managed to make it sound much simpler than people had believed it was going to be. So I think you've hit the mark as far as that's concerned. So thanks very much for not just today, but the previous three from Highlands and Isles Enterprise. It's been great to have you with us.
Great.
Today was supposed to be the last in the series, but I am able to reveal a little bit of exclusive information. I have managed to arrange an extra webcast, which will be on the 23rd of April. That's a Thursday. And for that webcast, we're going to be looking at a real growing market. Scotland's exports to the Middle East have grown to £1.5 billion in recent years. So it's a big market. It really is somewhere that you might want to explore. And on Thursday the 23rd, we'll have Colin Crabb and Alec Watson, who have extensive experience of exporting and doing business in the Middle East. They'll be with us to look at the Middle East as a marketplace. If you're new to that market, if you've never exported in that area before, then this really is a don't miss. And as ever, in order to find out a little bit more, the details have just been put on the Smart Exporter website, the link to which is immediately below us in the video window here. You'll also be able to get all the other information that's available from High through the Smart Exporter page. I was actually looking at it myself just the other day. There's a couple of really good case studies on there. If you want to have a look at those case studies, that might provide a little bit of inspiration for you. So click the link under the window when we're finished here, and that will take you through to the page. And if I could also just prevail on you for another couple of minutes, there's a survey, a client survey, which would be fantastic if you could just take 2 minutes to fill that in. It's really helpful from High's point of view to have your feedback, your suggestions and your ideas about what else you would like to see from them in terms of help with international trade. So it just remains for me to say thanks very much for joining us. Remember, it's not the last one after all. Thursday the 23rd of April at 12 o'clock, it's the usual time, when we'll be looking at the Middle East as a potential market. Make sure you get your booking in, and thanks again. Have a great afternoon.